Alrighty, hey all. Today I'm joined by Hélène. Say hello, Hélène.
Hi.
We're going to be talking about Mariana Ortega's book, or one of her books, titled In Between, Latina Feminist Phenomenology, Multiplicity, and the Self. But before we get into that, Hélène, what do you do?
I'm a PhD student in Women's Studies and Feminist Research at Western.
Okay, and your MA, what was that on then?
I did my MA also at Western, also in Women's Studies and Feminist Research. My MA was about the Little Red Riding Hood, and my PhD research is looking more closely at trauma in online space.
And I guess we both had the opportunity to meet Mariana, and we'll go more into, I guess, the affinities between her work here and what you're doing, or what you're going to be doing, and what you can take from this. Now, right off the bat, what is it? How do you read this text? Is it something that is brought to you in a certain way, or is it something that you read with a certain scope or with a certain lens that makes it stand out from other texts that you'd classify in this similar domain?
How do I read it?
Yeah.
I think I read it for Mariana Ortega's redefining of the self, of identity, in a way I think that fits better than traditional philosophical views of the self. And for my work specifically on trauma and its effects on identity, I think that Ortega provides a really interesting outlook on that.
All right, I guess on that note, there'd be no better place to start than there. So, starting out from the beginning, the first chapter, the New Mestiza and La Nepantalera. What are these things? What is the New Mestiza?
So Ortega defines the New Mestiza, which is borrowed from Anzaldua's work. So she uses the work of a few Latina feminists. So
Anzaldúa, though specifically, can you elaborate? Just brief Spark Notes version, what's going on with Anzaldúa?
Well, in terms of the New Mestiza, which the New Mestiza to Anzaldúa is a self inhabiting the borderlands, and this is taken from Anzaldúa's work called Borderlands. And so it's an in-between self. In Anzaldúa's case, it's an in-between between the United States and Mexico. And so Ortega says this New Mestiza self experiences a live struggle because she's split between cultures, races, languages, and genders, all tugging at her.
Right, and in that way, the New Mestiza it resists classification in some sense. But that's something we'll come to trouble in how Ortega deals with it, because it's not as smooth as that. In fact, there are moments where Ortega is critical of Anzaldúa's use of the mestiza figure.
There is ambiguity in the definition that Anzaldúa has of mestiza. So Anzaldúa calls it the mestiza consciousness, and she defines it as a differential consciousness, and part of that consciousness involves the ability to hold ambiguous, contradictory feelings, thoughts, aspects of the self, all at the same time. And the point is that you don't have to reconcile those aspects of the self. And so that sort of brings into question that traditional philosophical view of the self as this unified, sort of logical, rational piece that isn't doesn't contain this sort of ambiguity.
Now, without having actually read Ansel Dua's piece, while the Borderlands is certainly a space that allows for this figure to emerge in an interesting way, how is it supposedly different from the general degree of hybridity that affects nearly everyone? So just people, let's just say people in the United States, right? In those people in urban spaces that are, constantly being made to be present with other, divergent perspectives, divergent peoples.
I can't speak to Ansel Dua specifically because I haven't read her full work. But I think for Ortega, she would say that yes, we all experience ambiguity in our senses of self. We all act differently in different contexts. But the sort of important thing when we're thinking about Latina feminism in this specific context, and sort of the difference too between people who experience oppression and people who are privileged, would be this what Ortega talks about, the a sense of not being at ease. She has a thin and a thick, and so the difference is that for people that are living with oppression, they might be in a borderland, or in a space where they feel really not at ease, and that they're unable to fit within the norms that are expected in that space, or they're being called out, or they're in danger of violence in that space for particular reasons. The example that comes to my mind right now is an accent, a skin tone, a gender, and so that's kind of one of the important differences, I think, between just sort of acting differently at work and at home, and inhabiting a space in which parts of yourself have to remain hidden.
Yeah, and how Ortega perceives that is that, in her words, the tolerance for ambiguity and contradiction is, for Ansel Dua, absolutely necessary for the new mestiza's possibility for transformation and resistance. Now, when she frames it in this way, what exactly is it in resistance to? In your mind, like, Ortega isn't as clear as she could be on this, but in your mind, what is this resistance to? Is it just kind of the broad figure of patriarchal control, homogenization? Is it a little bit more specific?
Yeah, I think it's a potential, and I don't think that it can be specific, because we're talking about very broad, like a very broad sort of, not even a definition, but even just a discourse. So I think the potential for resistance there is, she uses a lot of Lugonis's work, and I think that...
well, who is Lugonis?
So Lugonis is another Latina feminist author. And so I think that the way that Ortega's using, and Ansel Dua are using this, this notion of the self, and of these, like the multiplicitous self is Ortega's term. So the self as being different in different spaces, in different contexts. There's a potential there for understanding others, for understanding yourself in different ways. So I think it's quite broad. I think that obviously, because Ortega's trying to situate her work in lived experience, she does give examples, so we can look to examples, but I don't know if I would put a specific definition to that potential for resistance.
Right, and Ortega warns against making it too abstract in a sense, though, because she says that the new mestiza needs to be understood as anchored in specific material conditions as a situated, embodied being. Anzaldua's Latina Feminist Phenomenology is at its best when describing her embodied experience in situated contexts in the precarious life of the borderlands. So on one side, it's like, okay, we have to avoid, these broad brushes, right? It would be naive to say that there's just one kind of homogenous form of oppression, whatever that might look like, and then there's only one broad, homogenous form of resistance. On the flip side of that, we want to be anchored in with this sort of this embodied approach, hence the phenomenology, or however we might conceive of that, as still resisting something, as still being opposed to something, which is where it's still a little bit murky, right?
Yeah, I think we're trying to avoid the abstract of a lot of traditional philosophy. So I think that, like you said, Ortega's grounding her theorizing in lived experience, in embodied realities, in the flesh, and so is Lugones, and so is Anzaldúa, and that's really important here. But I don't think that means that there aren't, lots of different types of oppressions, lots of different facets to the self, to groups, to group identity, and so we can talk about lots of different examples without making the concept abstract.
Right. But in that vein, Ortega's relationship with Anzaldúa is ambiguous. It's not totally clear how Ortega feels about Anzaldúa. It seems to go back and forth. There's some things, and it's not like she should like everything or dislike everything. For instance, she says that she's drawing attention to another critique that states that we must be wary of Anzaldúa's version of the mestizaje. Did I pronounce that right? I think it's something of that sort, who is ultimately dependent on a narrow vision of whites, which allows her to portray the mestiza identity as fluid, multiple, and resistant. So in a sense, kind of romanticizing this borderlands figure, while simultaneously denying that sort of hybrid potential to, those that don't occupy that space. Or is that too narrow?
So I think the critique that you're speaking to there is actually Beltran's critique of Anzaldúa, and I think that Ortega actually says, though that it can be read that way in parts, that Anzaldúa's project is actually a lot more complex and nuanced than that, though I think that there might be some implications of some essentialism in Anzaldúa's definition of the mestizaje.
Right, and that is an important distinction to make. And to move on from that, what Ortega identifies in Anzaldúa doing is, according to Ortega, according to Ortega, quote, according to Anzaldúa, in order for change to happen, you have to shift your consciousness from your customary ego-related point of view to that of the Naguala. She defines the Naguala as the feminine form of Nagual, the indigenous term for a shaman who shifts shapes. In Anzaldúa's view, the Naguala has to do with an aspect of the self that is unconscious. It is a creative, dreamlike consciousness able to make broader associations and connections than waking consciousness.
Yeah, I don't think I can speak to the Naguala so much, just because these are, these are cultural concepts that I have no experience with as a white Canadian person. I think that, the way that Ortega relates it to the concept of la facultad, which is, and she's quoting Anzaldúa here, an instant sensing, a quick perception arrived at without conscious reasoning, an acute awareness mediated by the part of the psyche that does not speak, that communicates in images and symbols. And she continues to call this process a survival tactic that is, again, latent in all of us, but particularly honed by border dwellers that constantly face difficult situations. So I think what I can speak to, though my familiarity with these concepts is very limited, is that the survival tactic aspect of that. And I think that, to me, this can be related to trauma, not that that's Ortega's or Anzaldúa's goal here. I don't want to assert that, but I think that these are responses that happen in these spaces of uncertainty, in these spaces where you have to hide certain parts of yourself and showcase others. And it's interesting because I think there's a lot of spirituality in here that I obviously don't understand that well, and Ortega herself says that she's not a very spiritual person, so she engages with it in her own way. But I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, well, for sure. And it's important to note this is the cultural distance, right? Because with this text, and I'm sure it's the same with Anzaldúa, there are terms, there are ideas, there are concepts that we just won't have access to. No matter, even if there's a definition attached to it, it's not as though these kind of cultural artifacts or these cultural notions can be captured in a few words in the form of a definition. There's going to be that distance.
Yeah, and I think that it's important for the work that these Latina feminist authors are doing, that their concepts and theories be located in these specific cultural, historical places. And that sort of brings it back to that sense of situatedness that Ortega's getting at with her discussion of the self.
So it's from that note that we move into the idea, into the second chapter. And it's in this chapter that we get heavier into the philosophical concepts. Now, some of them that were thrown around before, we're thinking of phenomenology, thinking of these ideas of the self, which have, regrettably a very deep tradition or have a very profound connection with the philosophical tradition. So in this chapter, we move into Heidegger. And as we know of Ortega, her use of Heidegger is very cautious, because Heidegger's relationship with minorities is not a good one. In fact, Heidegger's concepts can easily be criticized as exclusionary, can easily be viewed as disconnecting certain people from the various concepts of worlding, of being in world, that he's so famous for paving the way for.
I think Ortega does a great job of explaining that she's putting Heidegger in conversation with Anzaldúa and Lugones and other Latina feminists, scholars in her book. So she, I don't know if she identifies as a Heideggerian per se.
Well, I think she does. She wrote her dissertation was Heidegger,
certainly,
right?
In terms of expertise, she's an expert. So yeah, she's very cautious. She's also open to criticism about that, and speaks to it, I think, quite often. The whole introduction to this book speaks to that. But personally, I think she does a really great job of starting that conversation.
Right. So what she takes from Heidegger is two concepts mostly. First one being in the world. What does that mean for Heidegger? We'll explain, we'll get into that. But for now, the second term is Dasein. So moving back, what Ortega says of Heidegger is as follows. In the Heideggerian account, the self has a practical involvement with a nexus of equipment found in the world. This Heideggerian account of self as being in the world, of a self that is there, a Dasein, constitutes a critique against Cartesian epistemic subjectivity, in which the subject is understood as a substance, or a thinking thing, and the primary relationship to the world is via mental representations of things that stand outside the sphere of the subject's mind, which in a sense that would have some affinity with like the more Kantian ideas of representation of things in the world, how they're, they don't make themselves apparent to us by necessarily their utility or their function, which is, paramount to Heidegger's work, where, we can think of the many different examples that Heidegger gives, but in the case of like the hammer, as just one example of a figure in the world that, for Heidegger is very much alive. It's very much present. It has something of an essence, of being, if you will.
Right, so the self exists always and already in the world. There's no thinking about the self in space, in the clouds in this abstract way. The self exists in and with the world, always.
Right, and in that sense, Ortega wants to make clear, as she does, that Heidegger understands the self as always in process, as something in the making, which shares a certain affinity with how we were describing Anzaldúa. This kind of in-between figure is something that can't be grounded, something that doesn't necessarily have a steady ontological essence, but that is something that is susceptible to change, that is, existing in this Borderlands type space as being sort of metaphorical representation of that, does share something with Heidegger, which is how she locates the two or connects them.
Yeah, I don't know about the ontological essence. I'm not sure what Ortega would say to that, but certainly to me that in process kind of speaks to that potential for resistance.
In what way?
In that the self, as Ortega imagines it through Anzaldúa, through Lugones, through Heidegger, has this potential for learning, changing, developing with and around others. And so, that's very different from understanding this sort of self as already made and defined and unified and stable or fixed across time.
Right, but Ortega makes a distinction. She says that Heidegger painstakingly explains major ontological existential characteristics of a self that is thrown. Despite that, he unfortunately does not explain the specific ontic conditions, that is things in the world, things you can touch, that are of concern for the self that is there and that dwells in the world. His primary interest remains in fundamental ontology, in finding general ontological characteristics of human beings. And then she moves into Anzaldúa, and she says of Anzaldúa and other Latina feminists, however, they underscore the ontic, the specific material characteristics and conditions of human beings. Latina feminists concentrate on the particular power relations informing specific economic, cultural, and societal theirs.
Yeah, I think that, I think the way that I understand that is that she's saying that though Heidegger locates the self as existing in a world, that world is his world. It's not her world. It's not a lot of other people's world. So what she's saying there to me is that though Heidegger does understand that we're shaped by our world, he sort of only imagines a very specific type of world.
Right, and in that, ignoring the societal implications, those that deal with representation, with culture, or what have you, in shaping this sort of, to use Anzaldúa's term, the mestiza figure, or that in-betweenness. How does that in-between become informed not simply as an ontological condition that doesn't change, or part of an ontic condition that's, can be easily explained via connection to the world, but rather how it's shaped by other forces.
Right.
So it's in that sense drawing a distinction between Heidegger and these other Latina phenomenologists, that we see this sort of attentiveness to other conditions. Or in Ortega's words, the selves described by Latina feminist phenomenologists do not find themselves in the world with the ease the traditional existential phenomenologists describe. Which I think is safe to say, especially if we consider like the borderlands as being a totally separate space, like a space that defies a sort of classification, as being, in her words, the open wound between the U.S. and Mexico. Doesn't lend itself to a smooth analysis because it itself is not smooth.
Yeah, but I think too that it's important to also mention that these liminal spaces, or these spaces of uncertainty that Ortega is talking about, aren't necessarily the borderlands, right? They can, like, she talks about life in a white academic space. She talks about lots of her own experiences that are different from Anzaldua's. So the borderlands is, I think, Anzaldua's example.
Right, and I borrow from it because it's metaphorically charged. It does have a certain...
But it is real.
Well, that's the thing, and that's one of the critiques that Ortega identifies people have leveled against Anzaldúa, is that Anzaldúa at times is too much caught in, I guess, the metaphorical. Doesn't consider, the real, like, Anzaldúa, the cushy, like, tenure prof gig, but doesn't necessarily consider the real implications of those people, like, and of the people in those spaces.
But Anzaldúa has experienced this firsthand herself. She wasn't always an academic. She grew up, I think, in relative poverty, and has experienced the borderlands herself. I want to verify that.
So it's in that way that we approach a problem that Ortega identifies with Anzaldúa, and it's not something that it's something worth mentioning, where she says, again from someone else's perspective, she's quoting someone else here, Anzaldúa herself does not appeal to Mexican writers or provide a perspective from the Mexican side. So, like the Heideggerian approach, this Anzaldúa is like a figure to speak about the borderlands. In some way it can get distorted, according to this other critic. Just like how, evoking Heidegger to try and explain these types of phenomena is surely problematic, because we're not getting that perspective. We're getting this, kind of disconnected perspective.
Yeah, I mean, Ortega speaks a lot about identity politics later on, so maybe we'll get to that critique. So I wouldn't want to essentialize Anzaldúa's work or compare it so readily to Heidegger's work.
No, I don't want to do that either.
But certainly there have been critiques of Anzaldúa, because she does speak to sort of her queer identity as well, and in relation to the borderlands. So the borderlands to her in many senses is metaphorical. So I can see that critique from Mexican authors, for sure.
Yeah, but going back to how Ortega uses Anzaldúa and Heidegger, she states that being in the world, or being in worlds, is to be understood as a key existential characteristic of the multiplicitous self, and is meant to capture this self's complexity. Being in worlds, how it is plural, is what is interesting here. And the Heideggerian concept, of course, that it's not simply, it's not simply world. Even at times, I believe it is. But how, he even pays attention to the possibility of worlds, or of different worlds that clash, that develop in certain spaces, that are created in different ways, that have different forms, other different contents, different content.
Yeah, so I think my understanding of the being in worlds is as coined by Ortega, and this is where, to me, she differs from Heidegger in the way that we talked about, and also from Lugones, in that she's talking about being in worlds as what she says is meant to capture the multiplicitous self's complexity. So for Ortega, and this is the really interesting theory that she's putting forward in this book, the multiplicitous self is a singular self occupying multiple social locations, and a condition of in-betweenness. That's her words. So, the multiplicitous self, again, is continuous, but again, is different in different places. And this comes back to that contradiction and ambiguity that we talked about, where that one person can embody contradictory attributes and aspects of the self without losing other parts of herself, or without having to choose a truer identity. She can embody all of these different things.
Right. And that would be the limitation of Heidegger's notion of world, where, according to Ortega, the term world already involves the sense of the way in which human beings exist in the world by way of their activities and choices, and the sense of how they fare in the world that arises from such activities and choices. Now, Ortega wants, problematizes that and says, no, we have to consider, in her terms then, we need to consider specific issues connected to the intersection or intermeshedness of gender, race, sexuality, class, politics, ability, and so on, and how such social locations inform the way we are in worlds, and how these worlds, we think of like a mesh, like a spider web, right? How these different connections, or these different aspects come and form a web, and how it's not like a single point that defines who you are, but rather it's you are the meeting place of a multitude of different factors.
Yeah, and I think the differentiation between Ortega and Heidegger is important. I also think that how she sets herself apart from Lugones and Anzaldúa is also interesting. I think sort of what stands out to me is the difference between, for Ortega, multiplicity and plurality. And so for her, the multiplicitous self is, again, continuous. She talks about an existential continuity of experience despite multiplicity, whereas though it seemed to me like we're not quite sure where Lugones stands, because she says different things in different parts of her works, but it seems Ortega's understanding her as talking about plurality, which would be that the one person being a different self in different worlds, so having several selves, and I think that's a really important difference. But for Ortega, it's a continuous self.
Yeah, absolutely. Ortega confirms that idea when she says that even though there is a prioritizing of the future as the self, always projects herself toward the future, this notion of temporality is not a linear one, in which the self is always understood as moving forward. Rather, the linear framework that we would use as a sort of measure for this development of the self, or prior to this thinking about intersectionality as being like these sort of linear frameworks, or these very easily traceable kind of social categories that define you. Like, if you're an African American person, you're African American, that's it. Like, that's what your identity is. But now we can come to problematize these things. We can come to throw these things out of order, in a sense, along with the idea that, your identity as such came to you in a coherent, linear, teleological manner.
Yeah, I think the temporality piece is really important, especially as someone who's interested in trauma, because, like you say, for Ortega, the self is intertwined into within the past and the future and the present. And so she gets into this a little later, but it's not that over time you develop towards a certain identity which is better than the ones before it. Identities are they're always in progress, they're shifting and changing based on, events that are happening now, things that have happened in the past, things that will happen in the future. So there's, again, I think the idea of the web maybe is a good one to use here as well. There's no sort of hierarchizing of aspects of the self in this definition, and it's fluid.
Absolutely. And moreover, it's contradictory. So according to Ortega, this would also lead to the realization that we can embody contradictory attributes without necessarily having to choose one or the other as being the defining feature of ourself, and that it's okay to not, take on a specific identity or a number of identities and say that is what you are. In fact, I feel like Ortega would kind of advise against that, for those people that have the ability to. Like if we consider, ideas about survival and who necessarily has the privilege to embrace a contradictory persona, then perhaps we could problematize that a little bit.
I don't think I read the contradictory piece as a privilege necessarily. I think
No, but is it available to everyone, per se?
Her example of playfulness, which she takes from Lugones, I think is a good one. And she says, it's difficult for her to negotiate her own identity when she perceives herself as very playful in her Latino communities, but can't be playful in the white academic world in which that she inhabits at other times. So that's a contradiction for her. Like she's not sure if she's a playful person or not a playful person.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't think it's that you can or can't be contradictory. I think there's always contradiction. But I think where I like Ortega's conception of the multiplicitous self is that you don't have to choose one or the other.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a good segue into the next section where we begin to talk about world traveling. So for Ortega, she aligns herself across from Anzaldúa and Lugones, who she describes as speaking of ontological pluralism. Now, what she identifies herself as doing or being interested in is existential pluralism. So to kind of unravel those two slippery terms, that is ontology and existentialism, Ortega says that she understands Lugones' ontological pluralism as positing a multiplicity of selves as well as a multiplicity of worlds anchored in multiple realities. The limitation to that for Ortega is that posits there to be worlds that can be viewed, worlds that can be traced, peoples that can be viewed, peoples that can be traced, albeit, doesn't necessarily lend itself to an easy analysis, but each person has an identity, even if it varies drastically across different time, spaces, what have you. Now for Ortega, considering this existential pluralism, we are now entering the more unsteady terrain of contradiction, where we can't necessarily say that there's like a world over there and it has these characteristics, bada bada boom, that's it, or the same can be said of people. It's not as easy to do that. So to put that in Ortega's words, she says that of Lugones, who she says can be ontologically problematic, she says that first, in traditional to philosophical accounts, human beings are understood as being in one world and sharing that world, rather than constantly traveling to different worlds or having different realities. Second, In such accounts, the self is understood as a unitary subject, rather than the plurality of selves that Lugones herself claims. So it's in a sense that in the term ontological pluralism, the ontology takes over the pluralism, and suddenly those people that were at one point pluralistic in themselves suddenly become grounded, and then serve as sort of then fall under the aegis of pluralism, where they are then another group of people that can then be viewed, seen, regarded as being different from oneself, rather than seeing them as, contradictory beings that don't necessarily have a steady character, don't necessarily have a steady persona, but that are contradictory.
So I think that can bring us to sort of the world traveling concept that Lugones brings up and that Ortega uses in this chapter. So I think importantly for Lugones, she says the experience of being different in different worlds is an epistemic shift from being one person to being a different person. Whereas for Ortega, the multiplicity of self, she says, has access to an opening or aperture to different worlds. So again, there is a continuous self that can understand herself in the different worlds that she inhabits, and she can understand the different aspects of herself that are put forward, or that she has to put forward, or that she chooses to put forward in those different worlds as well. So there is still this continuous self in this theory.
And the way that Ortega separates herself from that is when she says, or it's made apparent when she says that her account then retains Lugones' understanding of worlds, insofar as they provide multiple perspectives through which I can understand my experiences and my sense of self. I do not, however, see the multiplicitous self as being in multiple crisscrossing realities. While I do not endorse multiple realities, I attempt to capture the multiplicity of ways in which the self is being in worlds. I do not consider worlds as atomistic and thus not intersecting or crisscrossing.
Right.
Right, so then now we can get into our idea, or how world traveling itself, or elaborate on it a little more, how it's something that opens up the possibility to disturb, previously held notions of what constitutes that self, because it's about meeting others in their own contradictoriness. That kind of makes that apparent. It kind of makes one's own contradictory self apparent. Gee, almost knocked your laptop off. That would have been good.
Yeah, so I think Lugones talks about how we can think about world traveling as a potential for resistance, because for Lugones, world traveling allows for people to connect to others, to see new possibilities, to understand oneself in different ways. And for her, even the possibility of, this is quoted from Ortega on page 100, of seeing oneself as capable of overcoming fear and domination, and as being creative and skillful in spite of the perception from the dominant group that considers that self as unworthy, inferior, and expendable.
So we could then go from there to this idea of a curdled self, which I know that you're interested in, or at least that you've thought about. And for you, what does that look like?
So the curdled mestizo self, this is again terminology from Lugones' work, and see, she talks about separating as curdling, and so the curdling would be, she says, yolky oil and oily yolk, as when mayonnaise curdles. So it's a metaphor that sort of points to the curdling is not homogeneous, so it's not neatly separated, but at the same time it's not completely mixed, a completely mixed substance either. So there are portions of your identity that you can sort of point to in specific ways, but at the same time you can't separate certain parts of your identity from others.
And then what can that say about active subjectivity for Ortega or for Lugones?
Yeah, so active subjectivity is again Lugones' term, and this is the idea that no one is either an oppressor or oppressed. It's not a dichotomy, because social locations overlap and intersect and intertwine in these ways. There's maybe certain contexts where one can oppress and be oppressed, certain contexts where one simply oppresses, other contexts where one is oppressed. So we need to be sort of in touch where with those with that occurring, rather than thinking of things simply as this like dichotomy of oppressor versus oppressed.
Right, and the way that Ortega defines or states that is that a rootedness on concreteness and thus an attunement to contextuality and historical intersections of the social motivates Lugones' journey, where it's not about thinking about things necessarily in clear binaural terms, or that these things are biunivocal, that they inform one another, but that we're always dealing with these on each side of the binary, if we can even just to propose a very easy analysis for now. What you see is a multitude of different different characteristics, different ideas that make up each side, that resist any sort of easy classification, and by extension disturb that idea of the binary itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is that the self isn't this individual thing within us. This is something that happens within the world with others. And so my understanding is that, so she says here on page 107, this is Ortega, rather than conceiving of intentionality as a directedness of consciousness to an object that takes place within the subject, she rethinks, she being Lugones, the idea of intentionality by dispersing it between subjects. So rather than thinking of the self as this, again, individual identity where I make decisions for myself that I want to make, Lugones is talking about how that sort of agency is complicated and problematized, because we're not always making individual choices, she says. And I think if we're thinking about this oppressor-oppressed dichotomy, intentionality isn't always as important as we might think it is.
Right. And that opens up another interesting domain where Ortega isn't so quick to say that these sort of resistant practices can only come about when someone is displaced in a sense, or displaces themselves and puts themselves in a situation where they're in contact with otherness, if you will, or other contradictory beings. Rather, she states that in her view, I do not need to be a different person, on page 115, I do not need to be a different person in another world in order to access resistant possibilities. By having access to multiple worlds and being between worlds, the multiplicitous self can encounter or develop possibilities of resistance. So the question then becomes whether this position remains within an oppressive colonial modern paradigm, and thus is, as Lugones would say, what is contained in oppression plus an excess. So to elucidate that point a little more, Ortega states that this question, we must ask if this question, or this possibility of finding resistance in a sort of otherness or going outside of it, if this logic that goes hand in hand, if it goes hand in hand with modernity, and is thus tied to domination. Is this the only logic available to us, such that any meaningful resistance has to arise from outside, as Lugones' view suggests? Even though she is aware of the importance of the limen as a concrete and theoretical space in which the self finds possibilities of resistance, we have seen that she considers resistant reactions as problematic, as they are still within the hegemonic oppressive system. Her recent concerns about the coloniality of power reinforce her vision of moving beyond or outside the dominant hegemonic system, that is, beyond the modern colonial matrix of power. So it is this distinction, then, that allows Ortega to state that her account of multiplicitous selfhood as being in and between, and being between worlds, attempts to avoid the issues that turn out to be ontologically problematic in Lugones' account, such as a vision of worlds that includes multiple realities, as well as an appeal to a multiplicity of selves that shift when world traveling. We're accepting that thesis, the one emblematic of Lugones, we tread dangerously close to the terrain of appropriation at times, or how it can be used, how the other or otherness or difference can be appropriated. I don't know, do you think that that's safe to say, or?
Can you explain that?
Like, if we just say attached to world traveling a sort of privilege or a certain ability to evoke resistance, then we are suggesting that it demands a certain contact with an otherness in order to challenge basic oppressive structures, frameworks, locations. But doesn't that, in a sense, risk appropriating a certain otherness?
I think for me, or it could be potentially problematic, is in the idea that the possibility of resistance for Lugones requires an ability to remember oneself in other worlds where she wasn't living in oppression.
Right.
For me, that's problematic because I'm not sure that that's available to all people, and I'm not sure that I'm willing to say that those of us who know nothing but an oppressive world or oppressive worlds can't world travel or resist in these ways. So the way that I interpret Ortega's take on memory as continuous happening within this continuous self, though obviously they are, that's not to say that they're not social. I think that with that definition, there might be a way to avoid that problem, in that there's always there's always a continuous memory of the multiplicity of the self for Ortega. So I don't think that the world traveling, for me at least, the world traveling in this case might not require reliance on memories of a world without oppression.
Can you say that in any other words? Like, can you elaborate on that a little more?
Well, I could be wrong, but I think my interpretation is that if memories are continuous, if we remember all of our experiences or many of our experiences, regardless of what worlds we're in, what we're occupying at a given time, then our sense of self is always informed by our experiences of oppression.
Right. But then would it be wrong to attach to memory a certain linear character, right? Where memory itself isn't always, truthful, as to use the word truth in like kind of capital T, like maybe not so far as capital T, but like linear chronological.
Yeah, it's not linear, but I don't.
But that memory itself can be contradictory, and that memory is not always
I like what
clear.
Ortega says. She says on, I think, 109, she says memory is genuine insofar as one has gone through the experience. So the accuracy of the memories, is can be questioned, but I think that they're still genuine.
Yeah, no. There's no saying that, like, that's what Republicans say, is that no, it's not a real memory. Like, when we think of people who are reliving a certain past or telling about a certain past, if it doesn't like adhere to a certain like systematic logic, then people are like, oh, there are holes in it, or this doesn't make any sense. But in us reading this, we are learning about the possibility of memory being very real, but at the same time being contradictory and being something that isn't necessarily, doesn't lend it. It's more aeonic, if I can use the term in that way, as opposed to like chronologic, as opposed to steady.
Yeah, not linear.
But yeah, no, I guess on that note, we'll sign off from doing about the first half of Mariana Ortega's book here. I hope that everyone enjoyed it. I know I did. It was interesting to me. Hélène, were you satisfied with?
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you liked it. That's good. But if anyone has any questions, of course, or any problems with anything we had to say, or if we got anything wrong, you know how to do it in the the comment section, and don't be shy. Just be respectful. But thanks for tuning in for those that made it this far, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.